Actually, I want this so I can see everybody. Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining me. My name is Darren Stockdale. I am a curriculum developer and teacher educator at the University of Michigan in the School of Education, former classroom teacher. I taught in middle school and high school social studies in Detroit for many years. And recently I've been doing a lot of work around the intersections of problem-based learning, place-based education, and disciplinary literacy, and just wanted to share kind of a snapshot of what that work looks like, and kind of talk through how I approach developing instruction that falls into that. It's hard to get in too deep into this in like a 50-minute session, so I'll do my best. It's a small group, so why don't we just take a quick minute, and if you want to just go through and introduce yourselves, and then we'll jump right into it. Just So Troy, why don't you go? I'll just call names, and you can just tell us where you're coming from and what you teach.
Troy Kilgus, Standish Sterling. I teach high school world history and AP government.
Molly.
Hi everyone, I'm Molly Gale. I am a social studies consultant at Oakland Schools.
Allison.
Hi, Allison Sullivan, Traverse City Area Public Schools, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade social studies.
And Tom.
Good evening, everybody. Tom Hinken, social studies consultant in Muskegon.
And Sarah.
I am from Eaton Rapids, and I teach at an alternative high school, so I have all the social studies classes.
You do it all. All right, great. Well, thanks for joining me, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and just kind of minimize this bar so you can see the slides. But since we're a small group, if you want to pause, ask a question, like I don't feel it's super necessary to get through every single slide. So if we pause and have a conversation, we'll pause and have a conversation. So please feel free. And there are a couple moments where I've built in for discussion, but if you have a question or want me to pause, just kind of unmute and let me know, and I'll click over and open up this bar. But for now, so we can see a little bit better. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a snapshot approach. Again, it's difficult to talk about these really complex approaches in 50 minutes. But what I'm going to do is just present a couple of models of what an entry event might look like as an activity to engage, to lead off instruction that gets into place-based education and disciplinary literacy. I'll touch a little bit on the broad strokes of place-based education, talk very briefly about disciplinary literacy instruction and the essential practices, and then talk about how they really connect to each other. And then we'll just think a little bit together about planning and problem framing. But really, this is meant to kind of reinforce what you're already doing, what you already know, or maybe whet your appetite for more, because as I said, it's going to be kind of a relatively broad overview. So activity before concept, if we want to think about how to integrate place-based education and disciplinary literacy and problem-based learning, let's think about what an opening activity model might look like. So this first sample is from a project I did with Stacy Woodward, who one of you knows quite well, who's a consultant at Oakland Schools in Metro Detroit, called Equitable Futures. And we started it off with this. So really quickly, just unmute, and what do you see? What are you noticing? This is the Detroit metropolitan area. Each blue dot represents a white person. Each green dot represents a black person. Red dots represent, these are based on census categories, so they're kind of problematic labels. They mask a lot of diversity, but red dot represents Asian. That kind of orange is Hispanic, and then brown is other. So just very quickly, what do you notice when you look at this map? It's from 2010, by the way.
Do I see the famous 8 Mile?
You sure do. It is a stark dividing line. And by the way, they stopped this was out of I think I can't remember what university put these out, but they stopped doing it because the numbers haven't changed that much, so it's still kind of similar. Yep. So 8 Mile is really stark. Just any other quick observations?
A lot of pockets of colors without a whole lot of overlap.
Yep. So we've got like that red pocket in the middle of Detroit, which is actually Hamtramck. Then we have Southwest Detroit, which is the Latinx community. So clearly what we see are these patterns of segregation and separation in the data. This is just a quick, this is Grand Rapids. It's not as clear, but you see similar patterns in Grand Rapids. So the question we ask students is, well, why do people of different races live in different places? And what do we need to know to answer this question through a historical? And by the way, this is in these, so we did this in these communities. We were doing this in Detroit, but not just in Detroit, in Dearborn, in Oakland County, and some certain districts. So this was place-based in the sense that students were learning about the demographics of the very community where they lived. So depending on the community, you know, this type of image may or may not work. So we posed to students, what do we need to know to answer this question? There's a lot more to this instruction than I'm including here, but we taught them about thinking like a historian and gave them some practice in corroborating, where you read across documents. And we introduced this driving question again: why do people of different races live in different places? Students watch a video and get some background information through a reading and a mini lecture to provide historical context. And then they have a corroboration tool. And then they jump into a set of documents. So they look at, you may have seen these maps. There's a series of redlining maps that were put out by the New Deal Housing and Loan Corporation. In 1936, these maps came out. And green neighborhoods in the map are primarily meant to stay white and had rules to prevent other people from moving in. Blue neighborhoods were a little bit more mixed, and so on and so on, whereas red neighborhoods were mostly African-American or immigrant communities. And these neighborhoods were kept this way to maintain property values and keep segregation in place, close to a host of other. So students are engaging with this, asking lots of questions. The teacher's role is to support them and help them figure out exactly what they're looking at. Another document they're looking at is a deed restriction from Shelby Township in Macomb County from 1952. And if you can read, you see at the end of this deed restriction, again, this is from 1952, so quite a while ago, but not that long ago. No temporary homes shall be built, shall not be sold to, rented to, or occupied by any person of Negro blood, and also not used for raising pigs, glue factory, or other dangerous or offensive purposes. So students are really shocked when they see that kind of language written into a deed restriction, but this was very common language, would be illegal now, but in houses that haven't been sold sometimes for quite some time, that language is actually still in and has to be struck out. So they're looking at this document, they're corroborating across, there's image analysis. They look at the 8 Mile Wall, which is still standing, which was meant to separate, this is within the portions of within the city, but literally separating white and black neighborhoods with a wall. So students are going through this. And in the process, again, of learning about the history of their community, just to pull this out, they're learning about these content excerpts. You know, this is touching on urbanization, the causes and consequences, some of the background knowledge is about the Great Migration. They're learning about cities being divided. They're learning about New Deal housing policies and the consequences of those policies, and looking at sort of Cold War challenges related to infrastructure, housing, poverty. So they're hitting the content expectations, but not in a really sequential way per se, but they are working on those. So that's just a quick example again, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about disciplinary literacy and place-based education in a second, but that's what this kind of work looks like. And if we were to take civics and throw out a civics example, it would look different, of course. So we might start with a watershed, the Saginaw Bay watershed, and ask students to think about, are there any threats to the health of this watershed? If so, what are they? Where do they originate? How do we deal with them? What role does government play? Lost my mouse. And we might start this off with a stewardship opportunity and get students out to actually adopt to this program called the Great Alliance for the Great Lakes has an Adopt a Beach program, and you can adopt a beach. It could be riverfront, it could be a riverside park, a lake, could be on one of the Great Lakes, or it could be an inland lake, and you go out and you clean it up. And there's whole protocols. We did this actually with a group of teachers and some place-based professional learning we were doing in Bay City. So this is where we were in Bay City along the Saginaw River, and we went out. We gathered, basically did a park and street cleanup and gathered trash. But one of the valuable parts of this program is you do a whole data analysis. So take a look at the data. Again, this is from a couple years ago or a year and a half ago along the Saginaw River. What do you notice in the data? So basically what you do is you have teams, everybody's got gloves and buckets and their safety protocols, and you're picking things up. And as you pick them up, you categorize them and record them. So what do you notice?
Lots of cigarette butts.
Yeah, lots of cigarette butts. So that's the idea, is that, we would actually figure out, first of all, what seems to be our local issue. And in this particular neighborhood, right along very nice park, there seems to be a lot of cigarette butts, and those things are typically washing right into the water. So we want students to take this up as a local issue, but we want them to take it up as a civic issue. So we develop a problem statement with students. So our data analysis shows that cigarette butts are commonly thrown into the streets in close proximity to the waterways. Generate a list of supporting questions. Students would help generate these. Why is it a problem? What are the different kind of components of this problem? If it's a problem, how do we understand it through different academic lenses? Like, how do we understand the chemistry of a cigarette and why it's bad for it to be in the water? And how do we understand it through a policy lens? What do we need to know? And then our civic lens is, what role does government play? What are the levels of government that are involved? What are the branches? So if we look at a problem like this, one of the first things we might do is, even in teaching students about the basic structure of government and who has responsibility, we might present something like this and ask them to learn about the roles of these different agencies and how they coordinate. But we have, the United States, the EPA, we've got EGLE at the state level, we've got the city government of Bay City, we've got the county government, the drain commissioner, and we have not-for-profits and community-based organizations like the Partnership for the Saginaw Bay Watershed. So one problem, like cigarette butts in the street that end up in the river, gives us access to talk about the whole structure of local government and how it interacts with federal government and state government. So it leads into a lot of rich discussion. We could take a different lens. So there's currently, or at least a couple of years ago, there was an effort in California to develop legislation around what's called producer responsibility, where the producers of a product would assume some responsibility for the environmental impact of their products. I'm not up to date on how successful they are in California with that, but the question we might want students to take up is anybody discussing this in Michigan? Do we think as students that this is a good solution? Should producers bear some responsibility? Why or why not? What do they think? Who's their legislator, and how do they contact them to ask about this? And how do you write to a legislator? How do you contact? What's sort of the right tone? What's the right format? Do you write a letter? Do you send an email? And then how would they find and understand any current laws or regulation that connect to this issue? And how is new legislation developed? So there's a lot of things that could come out of this one activity where they're picking up trash and helping to clean up a park. For instance, this is from the Bay City Storm Water Management Ordinance. And not surprisingly, of course, this is written in the normal sort of ordinance language, legalese. And it's not easy to find ordinances. It's not easy to navigate this sort of thing, but it's really valuable actually to be able to do this. And so this could be an interesting bit of civics literacy to teach students how to find and locate the ordinances that govern their daily lives in their community. So again, we have this experience in their community and we're taking it back into the classroom. So I'm gonna pop us. So just take a moment. What are you thinking? What did you notice about the questions being pursued? And what did you notice about the text or other ideas about the types of text that students might have to use in this kind of learning?
Pretty dry reading, right, for kids, those ordinances and such.
Yeah, yeah. Right, very dry. But so the question might be like, well, how do we kind of bring it to life? And so you might get a city council or somebody from the local ordinance department to come in, build that community connection. And it's also, it makes it a little more interesting when they figure out, when they're invested in the problem, like if they really take on this issue of, well, we're not just going to make everybody quit smoking. So what do we do? Can we get more? Can we get ashtrays? Is there a reason why there's not? Is there a reason why there's no signage? Like, who's responsible for this? And so by getting them engaged with the problem, the hope is, again, that they want to contribute to their community and get excited, and they're maybe willing to deal with it. But then there's also like this chunking component, like don't give them more text than they need. Like, so if we're reading ordinances, you know, give them a paragraph.
Yeah, but it is worthwhile for them to
Yeah.
learn how to read ordinances, right?
Yeah.
That's real life. It's
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's definitely authentic text. It's not like, okay, here's the lesson in the textbook.
Yeah. Yeah.
Here's about a place really far away that you can't, visualize. This is their data. And yeah, just like you said, there's no other way you could get them to interact with text at that level unless they were directly involved with,
Yeah.
The problem.
I was going to say too, I like that the questions seem to be leading to more questions, which
Mhm.
seems very authentic to me.
And that's the goal. And so what's missing, of course, so these are just ideas for entry events. And then after this entry event, you're back in the classroom, or maybe you never left the classroom. And it's using strategies like the question formulation technique with, if you're not familiar with QFT, you can just Google it. It's from the Right Question Institute. It teaches kids how to generate questions. It's a really cool protocol. And so the idea would be to present this kind of an entry event and then spend some time with kids just brainstorming, generating questions, and then helping them refine so that they're answering their own questions as they engage with the texts. Of course, this takes more time. And, like if you're teaching something like world history, it can be, where you feel like I've got to get to the 20th century, makes it challenging, but it's a worthwhile thing to think about. So I'm going to jump in and talk just a little bit about the instructional frameworks that we're looking at here, and then we'll have a little bit more discussion. Really, so place-based education, it's been around for a long time, certainly not a new idea. Many people are familiar with it, but many people still haven't had much experience with it. This particular model comes out of Teton Science, which is one of the national orgs doing a lot of really cool work in place-based education. And in their framework, place-based education connects learning with student engagement, student outcomes, and community impact. And it really looks at communities through this three-part lens of culture, economy, and ecology. So helping students learn about their own communities through sort of the cultural resources, the economic resources, and the ecological resources, and the tension between all those three as they're kind of coming into interaction with each other. Part of it is about local to global context. So there's a lot of using like a Zoom lens where we might think about something like climate migration, learn about that in a global context, and then zoom into our own communities, what's happening. Certainly there are instances in Michigan where natural disasters, there has been some recent flooding and some dams that have gone out in different parts of the state, and people have had to move. So climate migration is not something that doesn't happen in Michigan, but Michigan also gets referred to as a place where climate migrants are going to come to because we have a lot of fresh water. So like we could take a global issue like climate migration, do some case study work, and then zoom in and think about how it affects our own community, just as another example. Learner-centered, so the students are doing something, asking questions, and really generating their own inquiry frames to take off and sort of guide the learning, and is inquiry-based. There's some design thinking involved, potentially, if students are trying to solve a problem. So the community is the classroom and the classroom is the community. It's kind of this interactive process where we're looking at the community almost as a text where we can learn about the content that we have to learn. It's also interdisciplinary. So that idea around cigarette butts, you know, if schools were structured a little bit differently, and some have a little bit more freedom, but you might have the biology teacher doing something on ecosystems and pollution and ecosystems at the same time as the civics class is trying to do that. So there's always room for interdisciplinary approaches. The way we do scheduling makes that kind of challenging sometimes, but there are schools that are able to do that. So place-based education is also connected to the Great Lakes. There's this wonderful organization in Michigan called the Great Lakes Stewardship Initiative. And there's a link at the end of this presentation. If you're not familiar with them, you can also just Google them, but they're one of the leaders in place-based education in Michigan. And they have these principles for stewardship and place-based education. And one of the first ones is that we situate environmental learning and stewardship in the places where students live, grow, and play. And we help students understand human-environment interactions in their political and socioeconomic contexts. And I would add in their historical contexts. So we can't understand like any natural resource issues today if we don't look back to the history of industrialization and even like the timber industry in Michigan. So we have experiential learning, it's inquiry-based, there's instruction in multiple disciplines and ways of knowing. So these are these principles for place-based education, and they really result in, if we're sort of moving in that direction towards really rigorous and rich instruction. Parallel to that, we have this different framework, but they're frameworks that I'm in really trying to figure out how to integrate of disciplinary literacy instruction. So disciplinary literacy is this idea that the knowledge and skill with specialized language and technical vocabularies and discourse practices, this is what disciplinary literacy is, right? It's this, that there's knowledge, skill, technical vocabularies, and discourse practices that characterize different academic disciplines. So there's historical literacies, there's kind of political science and civic literacies, and they cross over and they inform each other, but these different disciplines are pretty unique. Math has its own form of mathematical literacy that's a lot about moving across symbol systems, associating numbers with symbols and words that inform some of what we do in other disciplines, but it's really quite unique as well. So to teach disciplinary literacy, teachers have to involve learners in inquiry that allows them to gain insight into how questions are asked. And then they're really drawing conclusions, they're supporting them, they're communicating. And in that process, they're using these literacy practices. This is different than content area literacy. It's very similar, and content area literacy work doesn't go away with disciplinary literacy, but it stays more true to the goals of a particular discipline. So I often use the example of a strategy like talk to the text, which is a great strategy. I love it, but I like to make it a little more disciplinary by thinking of it as like talk to the text like a historian would. What questions would a historian ask? And so when we add that historical lens, for instance, we're moving beyond content area literacy, which is super important, and into disciplinary literacy. To give you a quick example, going back to the cigarette butts. So if you look here, one of these texts is, again, from a city ordinance. The other one is from a scientific text. And obviously they're really different. Their structure is different, the language, the prior knowledge you need, the type of, there's numbers and symbols and Latin words in the scientific one. So this is just an example of and obviously, we're not going to use these texts with students without a lot of scaffolds and supports, but I might actually show students these texts to help them understand the difference between different types of text, and the different disciplines and different domains really use language and text in different ways. And disciplinary literacy, again, it moves beyond the generalized strategies of reading and writing across the curriculum. Again, emphasizing those are great and should not go away, but we want to take them further into the disciplines. And then DL also introduces students to thinking and literacy practices that characterize these disciplines. And the goal isn't to turn every student into an expert, but rather to give them the tools to critically analyze information coming out of these disciplines. Now more than ever, with social media and all the information that kids are exposed to, we know they need to be able to question the source and question the historical context of a document and corroborate sources. So those types of reading practices are super important. So to get at disciplinary literacy, there's a statewide initiative called the Disciplinary Literacy Essentials, which is basically a set of essential instructional practices for disciplinary literacy development in grades 6 through 12. There's a specific content version for each of the main core content areas. And we have ongoing professional development around these kind of at different times during the year. Each set of practices is supported by research. Really quickly, I'm going to walk through the first 5 of these, or first 4 of these practices, and then we'll pause and have a quick moment of discussion. So the first one is problem-based instruction. So you see, again, the connection. If we can find a locally based problem, we can really merge problem-based learning, place-based education, and disciplinary literacy. So we want to develop and implement interactive problem-based units that really frame out a need to read and write for a disciplinary purpose. So for instance, with the prior example, how does one develop and propose legislation at different levels of government? How can we use legislation or policy to help solve the problem of cigarette butt litter in our watershed? Who, again, this question of what level of government is the most appropriate to approach with this, and how do we know that? So that might be a problem frame that we get going. So then the second practice is, once we have our problem frame, we need to go beyond the textbook. We can still use the textbook, but we need students to get diverse text and abundant reading opportunities. So they need a wide range of disciplinary text, print, audio, digital, a wide range of things that see the discipline as connected to their lives. So again, we might grab existing legislation, we might pull out the Constitution and figure out where in the Constitution does it say that, oh, well, the states are in control of everything else. And where does it give the federal government, control over certain waterways and things like that? Or what legislation, what's the Clean Water Act? We might look at policy briefs that other organizations have put out. So there's a huge range of text we might pull in. The struggle is like that picking and choosing, right? Like what do we include, what do we leave out? And then we want intentional and standard aligns instruction and disciplinary reading. So the teachers establishing a compelling reason for reading beyond like, hey, this is your assignment, you need to do this for 10 points, or this is going to be on the next text. We need to figure out how to read this law, and we need to figure out how to use our textbook to help us understand the difference between local, state, and federal government, because we want to help solve this problem, and this is going to help us do that. And then the teachers explicitly naming and describing and modeling the dispositions and patterns of thinking typical of the disciplines. There might be a discussion of, why do you think legislation is written this way? Why don't they just use, and you could actually get a legislator in maybe and ask them, why do you write things this way? Where does this tradition come from? And how do you communicate with your constituents about laws? And then the teacher might, again, with a very limited piece of legislation, begin to model and teach students at an age appropriate level. What's the structure? Because all legislation follows a similar structure. So how do you begin to understand the structure of legislation to pull out what you really need to know? The fourth set of practices is about disciplinary writing. So why are we writing in civics, for example? So what might be some compelling reasons for writing? And there's a ton of them. And so again, the teacher's going to name, describe, and model the dispositions and teach students to write for different purposes and audiences authentic to the discipline. So for instance, if I want to convince my city council that they need to adopt a new ordinance, I might have to write a basic policy brief or draft a proposal for a local ordinance. And students can do that kind of work with support. You use templates and sort of word banks and things like that. And again, have a staff member from a legislative office or the city council come in and help out. They're not often asked to come help draft a proposal. So I bet you could get a taker if you were doing something like that. So those are the first 4. So this is a lot, and there's way more to this, obviously, but what are you thinking now? How does this connect to the type of instruction you currently see? How might it extend it? Any challenges in there?
only thinking about the longevity of a project like this, you know, you look for something really good that you can repeat for a few years before you have to sort of do it all over and make it modern again. So I'm just wondering about, you know, if you're every year seeing, here's the same problem with cigarette butts down at the river, you know, and 5 years later, nothing has changed. How does that inform or change what the students are doing?
Yeah, no, it's
I'm
great.
just,
Yeah, no, it's a great point, because you want to like build off it and, you know, yeah. Mhm. I mean, part of it requires getting to know, and this is easier, and, you know, in some places, teachers are working in the, maybe teaching in the very school they went to, and they've been in the same community for, you know, their whole lives. Other teachers are living 20 miles away from where they teach and have never lived in that community and only go there. So it's like, there's always this challenge too, it's different for every teacher depending on their context. Like, do you know your community? And some teachers are a part of their community and know it is their community, whereas others haven't had the time or the ability to really immerse themselves in a community and understand the issues that their kids might face. So like in different contexts, it presents different challenges.
So I do quite a bit of place-based and project-based here with the social studies teachers in our county, and I see how, and we do the inquiries, there's just so many, right? There's place-based, there's project-based, there's inquiry, there's a disciplinary literacy, and I think they all can play together and lead to like really strong learning. But what I struggle with is how to present that in a package, right, to the teachers, so they're not overwhelmed and trying to learn so many things at a time. So that's kind of a challenge for me, I guess.
That's a huge challenge. It's a great point to make. Absolutely. Yeah. So I think part of it is like making it figuring out how to make it manageable. So number one, so it's almost like doing PBL light. So like a real full-on project-based learning that takes so much time to plan and really do well. And then disciplinary, but you really can do them all at once. So for instance, going back to the initial example around segregation in the Detroit metropolitan area, which again, you could do in other metropolitan areas that have similar patterns. That was essentially a 3-day lesson, but what it did is it said, all right, we are going to engage students with this entry event, which is that racial segregation map, and have them generate some questions on that. We're going to give them some historical information with a video and a short reading. So we're going to build enough contextual knowledge. And then their historical literacy work, their DL, their disciplinary literacy work, was about corroboration. It was one practice, like one specific thing with a very limited text set. So they had about, I think, 7 or 8 texts, and they're working in groups. So then they had to figure out what claims could they make in answer to this question: why do people of different races live in different places? Not a complete answer, but what can they pull from these documents that help them answer that question? And then they had a discussion, and they did a short reflective writing based on that. So that's like, took about 3 days, and it hits it project-based, inquiry-based, place-based, and disciplinary literacy. It doesn't do everything in all of those models, right? But it does something in all those models. So I think it's about like finding the example, finding the model, the topic that connects to the community, and then making it really manageable and starting small. I think sometimes it is overwhelming when thinking about, but if we think about it, in fact, I'm going to go through a couple more slides because I think I kind of answered that in other things, but it's a great question. So it all starts with the problem, right? So thinking about helping teachers understand, one of the things that we're doing is we're not teaching topics, we're teaching about problems or questions, and it's inquiry based. And so that, and different people are in different places in terms of that shift, right? So the first thing we want to think of is helping teachers develop a good problem frame. And a good problem frame is authentic and has value outside of the school. So somebody outside of the school cares about it, particularly in your community, and it requires content. requires the use of content. So going back to the cigarette butt question, whose responsibility is this? You can't answer that without getting it separation of powers, without getting at the levels of government, which is core civic content. Generates a range of supporting questions. So it can't be, obviously it can't be a yes or no question, right? It's got to be a relatively open-ended question. Involves a reasonable amount of content and time. So it's got to be something that you can actually, they don't have to answer or solve it, but they've got to be able to add something to their understanding. Requires higher order conceptual thinking, but it can be scaffolded so we can build in some supports. I can provide some quick background knowledge in a video or a mini lecture. So they don't need to know everything, but they need to be able then to do some of that disciplinary work. There's more than one possible answer, and it's interested and connected to their communities. And again, and this number 8 is super important. You can actually get the resources you need to do it, right? So, I mean, sometimes you get all excited about a problem, then you can't, this happens to me all the time when I'm designing curriculum, then I can't find any accessible texts. So I'm left with the choice of either writing from scratch the text that students are going to use, or just choosing something else. So you have to have access to the material. So starting off with a good problem frame, and then of course that aligns to the content that teachers are supposed to engage with. And thinking about, if we look at this intersection, it's really about student-centered disciplinary inquiry into local issues of equity and quality of life. So thinking about every community in one way or another is dealing with one of these themes. And these appear across all historical eras, across all geographic locations. They cross content, they have policy implications, they have civic history, economic implications. So land use, how is the land used and who decides that? Urbanization and rural living, like what are the patterns, the population patterns? Industrialization and economic activity, human environment interaction. So any one of these is connected to local issues in any community. So, and students need to learn about all these, they show up in the 5 themes, they're connected to the 5 themes of geography, they're all throughout the content expectations in C3. So if we think about what's a local issue that students might be interested in that connects to one of these broad themes that also then connects to some of the content that I'm supposed to teach in my course. So I start thinking at that level, and then, just actually literally like start looking through my local newspaper and seeing what's in the local newspaper and what are people talking about and what are the issues and then I might talk to some students and, what issues concern them, maybe develop a quick student survey. And it takes time, but sometimes just something happens in your community and it's like, oh, we're going to do this. And sometimes it's really easy because, I was working with teachers up in Midland, Bay City, Saginaw area when there was the dams burst or the levees burst up there and there was flooding. It was like, oh, we're going to talk about this because students need to learn who was responsible for building this and maintaining it and why did it not function and what does climate change have to do with this? And there's just a ton of content around that. So thinking about those kinds of local issues as they happen as learning opportunities. So an initial idea, might be this is a world historical question. It's also a US history question. It's a Michigan history question. It's a geography question. But why do people move? And how does this change across space and time? So I could look at this in a world history, 7th grade world history, or high school world history. What broad patterns of push and pull factories shape human migration? I could zoom in. This is this idea of a zoom lens. What push and pull factors shape immigration to the United States in the early 20th century? When did people really start coming to Michigan? It's when Henry Ford started paying people $5 a day, at least in southeastern Michigan, but that was a huge population shift. And then in every community, where do the people that live in my community come from? When and why have different groups of people come and what larger patterns do they represent? So it's like you could get into family history or community history and expand out and connect it to these larger narratives. So like this, depending on the course and whether or not this fits, but you could do this in 6th grade with human geography. You could do it in 8th grade or, probably high school US history. And then talk about how does our community, what kind of a pattern does our community represent in terms of push and pull factors, in terms of why people came here and where they were coming from. That's like just one pretty concrete example. And then the disciplinary literacy, if you're doing it from a historical lens, then the work is, can I find some primary sources? Are there images? Are there photographs? Like how can I leverage this really engaging question to teach kids about their community and also teach them these really valuable skills? So yeah, and then these are that next set of questions. So what documents, sources, images will allow students to explore this? Can I actually build the resource set? And if the answer is no, you pick another question. Then you think about what are the historical thinking and reading practices that students need to utilize? How will I teach and assess these practices? And starting small becomes the key. So if students haven't done a lot of work in historical reading, if they're not familiar like with Weinberg's sourcing, contextualization, and corroboration, the Stanford History Education Group has a ton of resources on that. So you could pull up, like if that was the angle and they were new to that, you might just start with 3 documents or even 2 documents. Find a textbook chapter or chapter summary even that summarizes some of the broad patterns, and then have them look at 2 primary sources and discuss in groups. Do these primary sources map onto the patterns described in the textbook, or do they show us something different? Are these like outliers? Are these non-examples of what the textbook is talking about? And that's a really disciplinary angle and a disciplinary question, and it wouldn't take a ton of time. So it's also about like finding the right bite size to do this, to introduce students to these practices. And then students have to have time to talk and collaborate in this process and really do some of this historical reasoning where they're connecting past to present. We think about what they might produce. If I don't have a lot of time, everything from a short exit pass as my formative assessment to a full-on project or an oral history. The sky's the limit, but well, time is the limit, right? We're always bound by time. But thinking about how they're going to demonstrate their learning beyond the test. So this collaboration becomes really important, and collaboration like at different levels. So I'm also thinking about how do I make this manageable? So I might just do small group brainstorming to help students surface and consider prior knowledge and even the playing field. So some students have more prior knowledge than others, those that are interested in this, or maybe they watch A&E all the time or the Discovery Channel and they just happen to be experts in what you're talking about. I'm sure you've all experienced the kid that surprises you by knowing everything about a very narrow topic. And so we want that kid to contribute, but we want the other kids to learn from them. And so we want to do some brainstorming and find out and map out, maybe using a strategy like list group label, where you list what you know, you group it into categories, and then you name each category. And teams can do that. And you put it up on the board or on the wall, and then you add to it and you change it as students develop more knowledge. So that's like a brainstorming idea. Text analysis in a jigsaw format. So with disciplinary literacy, and you have 6 great texts, primary sources you want to use, but you don't have enough time. Well, you put your kids in groups, and each group gets a particular document, and they become the experts in that document. And then they produce a summary, or they do a short presentation, or you do a gallery walk and students have to take notes. There's different ways to do it, but Jigsaw activities are great, where you position students as the experts in a very narrow topic or a particular text, and you share the cognitive load. Or maybe they become experts in a particular text, and then you have a new group with 4 kids, and each of those kids is expert in a particular text, and they have to synthesize across the text and combine their knowledge to generate a new claim. And again, chunking and preparation of the text becomes key depending on the grade level and the readiness of the kids. You can still do this you can do it with images. You can do it with all sorts of different texts that are at different complexities. So there are ways to share that cognitive load. And there's always the group project and the performance assessment, where you have individual accountability measures, but kids are working together to produce a policy brief or an infographic or a PowerPoint and a speech. So we're looking for these opportunities to build collaboration into this kind of work. And when we're planning these things, this is kind of, beginning to wrap up here. We're thinking about, what is my community? What are the issues? What are the opportunities? What are the resources, the organizations who might be interested in partnering with me? What's the content that I have to teach, the core concepts? What do my students care about? And what are the resources I actually have access to? And then the intersection of these things, when I find something that fits, that hits all these areas, that's what I'm going to cover. And it can take some time. And then, so just some quick planning questions. So, who and what is our community? Again, what are the issues? Who are my students? What problems do I want them to address? We're almost out of time, so I'm gonna kind of, so this slide, I think, hopefully you'll have access to this. I'm more than happy to share it with you. So I'm gonna put my email address up on there. If you want access to the slideshow, just jot down my email, darastock@umich.edu. And what I'll do is turn it into a PDF or something and put it up on Google Drive and send you all the links. So just shoot me an email if you'd like access to it. Basically, I want to save like the last minute for any additional questions or thoughts. This was a lot to try to cover in 15 minutes.
Is there a plan for any sort of hub of information? So these ideas or resources could be shared. And I know it's all sort of like place-based stuff, but I could maybe find an idea that somebody had in Bay City and apply it to Grand Traverse Bay or similar.
So the Great Lake Ship Stewardship Initiative has a series of case studies on their website, and they're really, really cool. So that's the first place I would look.
Okay.
Yeah. And then again, feel free to email me. Like if you just want to have a follow-up conversation, you just want a thought partner. I'm kind of a nerd for this kind of stuff, and I don't mind exchanging emails and bouncing ideas back and forth.
Okay. Thanks, Darren.
Yeah. Yeah, so let me actually go back a slide. Well, I don't know when they're going to kick us out. But so Great Lake Stewardship.org has really good place-based. They have a couple nice videos, and they have these case studies, which are really quite rich. And I think provide some really cool examples of what this work can look like. I'm actually helping them think about, and we're working together to think about what would it mean to include disciplinary literacy more visibly in some of this work. So we're working, and there'll probably be some professional learning opportunities next fall or in the next year. So if you're interested in that, again, whatever, just shoot me an email. And then the disciplinary literacy, if you just go to literacyessentials.org, if you're interested in looking at those, if you haven't had a chance to check those out, they're at literacyessentials.org.
Great.
All right. Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate you taking the time out of a busy, April's always a busy month for us educators. So thank you for taking the time out and joining us.